In the dead of winter on a road that nobody drove anymore, something had been waiting. 4 stories of dark granite, a ruin the whole county had given up on. 2 buyers had come. Both turned back. She did not turn back. She went through the iron gate sideways, up the path, into the dark, through the hall, through the kitchen. And there in the back wall a door, painted to match the plaster around it. Easy to miss, meant to be missed. An iron loop for a handle. She lifted it. The air that came up from below smelled like stone, like deep earth, like something held patiently, deliberately, for exactly the right person. She went down into the dark. The morning of November the 4th, Dorothea Finch sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor of a law office in Concord, New Hampshire, and listened to her son explain why she could no longer be trusted to manage her own life. Daniel had prepared for this. That was the first thing she noticed. There were printed documents in a manila folder with color-coded tabs along the edge. There were bank statements, paper-clipped in a neat stack. There was a legal pad with handwritten notes she could not read from across the table. He had dressed carefully, blue-tie dark jacket, the particular formality of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument and had decided to make it. He was 44 years old. He had his father's jaw and his father's way of holding his shoulders when he was trying to project confidence he was not entirely sure he possessed. Watching him, Dot felt something sharp and wordless move through her chest and settle. She did not let it reach her face. Patricia sat to Daniel's left with her hands folded on the table in a way that communicated something between support and apology. She had not looked directly at her mother since they had sat down. Patricia was 41, and she was the one who had cried at Gerald's funeral, while Dot had stood at the graveside with her hands at her sides and her face absolutely still. And afterward, Patricia had said in the parking lot in a voice full of worried confusion, "Mom, it's okay to fall apart a little." And Dot had looked at her daughter and thought of all the things she might say and said none of them, because the list of what needed to be done had already begun assembling itself in her mind, and falling apart was not on it. The attorney, a younger man named Farrell, who kept removing his reading glasses and replacing them, sat at the head of the table and listened to Daniel with the professionally neutral expression of a man who had witnessed this particular kind of meeting many times before and had arrived at something between patience and distance in his response to it. Daniel said that her monthly income from 35 years as a certified estate appraiser, $1,420 in pension payments, was structurally insufficient to carry the outstanding medical debt from Gerald's final 8 months of hospitalization, which stood at $71,000 and had not moved in 4 months because she had not been making payments. He said that she had declined 3 separate offers of financial assistance from family. He said that her most recent decisions regarding the household on Aldermore Road suggested that she was not, in his assessment, operating with full clarity about her circumstances. He did not specify which decisions he meant. Dot did not ask. She kept her hands in her lap below the table's edge where no one could see them. And she looked at the printed documents and the bank statements and her son's careful handwriting on the legal pad, and she thought about something she had not thought about in years. She thought about this morning in 1997 when she had been called to appraise the estate of a retired shipping broker in Portsmouth. She had gone through the house methodically cataloging the unremarkable accumulation of a comfortable life and had been nearly done when she reached the back bedroom closet and found on the top shelf in a cardboard box a small ceramic bowl wrapped in a Portsmouth Herald from 1987. She had reached into that box with the automatic efficiency of someone who had opened 1,000 such boxes, and then her hands had stopped. Not because she had thought anything yet, because her hands had known before her mind caught up, before the conscious assessment had run its course and arrived at a conclusion. The bowl had told her something in the first second of contact that took another 60 seconds to translate into language. Qing Dynasty, Yongzheng period, cobalt blue on white. The broker had bought it at a barn sale in Barrington for $14 in 1971 because he thought it would look good on the shelf above the television. She had stood in that closet for a full minute before she said anything, not because she needed the minute to be certain. She had been certain in the first second. She had needed the minute to allow the certainty to arrive at the pace it deserved. The bowl had sold at Christie's for $230,000. She was thinking about that now, about the distance between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was, about the particular blindness of people who looked at surfaces and believed they had seen the object while the object waited beneath the surface with the patience of something that had been patient for a very long time and had learned not to require recognition in order to remain what it was. Daniel finished speaking. Farrell turned to her and began to explain what limited financial guardianship meant in practical terms, what decisions would require approval, and what threshold would trigger that requirement, and what her right to respond to the petition entailed. She waited for him to finish. Then she said, "Is there anything that requires my signature today?" There was a pause in the room, the kind of pause that happens when the person expected to be overwhelmed demonstrates that they are not. Farrell said no. He said the formal petition would be filed within the week. Dot stood. She collected her coat from the back of the chair with the same deliberateness she brought to everything that required her hands. She told Daniel she would see him Sunday for dinner. She told Patricia to drive carefully because the forecast had mentioned ice on the Everett Turnpike. She thanked Farrell for his time. She took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, she stopped at the water fountain and drank and straightened up and stood with both hands on the cool metal rim and breathed twice evenly through her nose. Then she pushed through the glass door into the November air. $340 in her checking account, $71,000 in debt, an oil tank a week from empty, a house on Aldermore Road with Gerald's reading chair still positioned at the same angle he had left it 13 months ago, because she had not moved it, not because she could not bring herself to, but because she had not yet decided what she thought about moving it, and she did not do things before she had decided what she thought. She walked to the parking garage with her coat buttoned against the cold, and her face showing nothing of what she was carrying, because she had learned in 69 years that the space between what a person felt and what a person showed was one of the only territories that remained entirely sovereign. She had work to do. She just did not yet know what it was. She did not know yet that by this time tomorrow she would. Walter Pruitt had lived across the road from Dot and Gerald for 16 years, and in that time he had become the precise kind of neighbor that most people spend their lives failing to find, and many people spend their lives failing to be. He was 73. He had gone to Vietnam at 19 and come back at 21, carrying things he had spent the next 5 decades reorganizing into something he could live with. And the result of that reorganization was a man who moved through the world with a particular quality of attention, unhurried and observant, the attention of someone who had learned that being present was not a passive condition, but an active one that required daily maintenance. He kept a wood pile that was always square and clean. He maintained a kitchen garden through October with a discipline that had nothing to do with whether he needed the vegetables and everything to do with the value of things that were tended. He drove a truck that was 20 years old and mechanically sound because he serviced it himself with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. After Gerald died, Walter had come every morning for 3 weeks without saying anything about grief or loss or how she was holding up. He had knocked on the kitchen door, and she had opened it, and he had come in and made coffee, because she was sometimes still in the habit of making only 1 cup, and they had sat at the table, and he had talked about things that had nothing to do with loss. The weather, the state of the road, a screech owl that had taken up residence in the hollow birch at the back of his property, and that called at an hour that had begun to interfere with his sleep in a way he found more interesting than annoying. He did not ask what she needed. He did not offer advice. He was simply there in the chair across from her, drinking coffee, occupying space, in a way that said without words that the space was not required to be empty just because one person was missing from it. On the evening of November the 4th, he knocked on her kitchen door at 6. She was at the table with the electricity bill and the oil company's statement and the quarterly summary from her pension administrator spread in front of her in the arrangement she had developed for looking at the full picture at once, without having any single document be the one that broke through her composure. She had been doing this long enough that she could look at the arrangement without flinching. That was not the same as it being all right. It was simply the result of practice. Walter came in and she put the kettle on without asking, and he sat across from her and looked at the documents on the table for a moment without comment, and then looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about the documents. He had been to a meeting, the Aldermore Historical Society, which met monthly at the Grange Hall on County Road 3. He had not gone for the history. He had gone because the Grange Hall had reliable heat and the people were generally tolerable, and it gave him something to do with the first Tuesday of the month that was not sitting in his own kitchen. He said there had been some discussion at the meeting about the Prescott property on County Road 6. Dot looked up from the kettle. She knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name in the way that things become part of the landscape, not through any single event, but through the accumulation of years of being there. A presence that people stopped seeing with fresh eyes and simply incorporated into their understanding of the place they lived. She knew it as a silhouette. She had driven County Road 6 many times over the 16 years she had lived on Aldermore Road, and each time through the trees in winter, when the branches were bare, you could see it rising. 4 stories of dark granite against whatever sky was above it that day. The northeast tower, with its particular lean which had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and which gave the building a quality that was somewhere between dignity and catastrophe. The collapsed east wing, which had come down sometime in the 80s and whose absence had changed the profile of the building in a way that was more eloquent than any intact structure could have been, the way a sentence broken off mid-clause says something that a complete sentence cannot. People called it the Prescott Ruin, the way they called things by the names that accumulate from long familiarity, which is to say casually and without full awareness of how completely the nickname had replaced what the thing actually was. Walter said that the county had been sitting on the property since Roland Prescott died in 2021 with no immediate heirs and distant family members who had looked at what he left behind and wanted no part of any of it. The county had tried to sell it twice. 2 separate buyers had come to look and had not come back. The estimated cost of demolition alone was $600,000, and no developer wanted to take on the liability, and the county had been carrying it on its books as an unresolved problem long enough that the county board had apparently decided at their last session to try something different. They had set a new price. Walter looked at his coffee cup. He said $250. Dot sat across from him at the kitchen table with the electricity bill and the pension statement and the oil company notice arranged in front of her, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she asked him to say the number again. He said it again. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at them the way she looked at things she was assessing, which was without preconception and without the particular kind of hope that distorts assessment into wishful thinking. She looked at them as what they were, which was the arithmetic of her current situation. Then she looked at Walter. She said, "I have $240 in my wallet." Walter looked at his coffee cup. He wrapped both hands around it. He looked at the window where the last gray light of the November afternoon was failing into dark. Then he got up from his chair and went to his coat where it hung on the back of the kitchen door. And he reached into the inside breast pocket, and he came back to the table and placed an envelope between them and sat back down. He did not explain the envelope. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup again and looked out the window. Dot looked at the envelope. She said, "Walter." He said, "I've been carrying that around for a while. Wasn't sure what it was for." He paused. "I think I know now." She said, "I can't." He said, "You're not going to debate me on this. I've made my decision." He looked at her, then directly with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned to look at difficult things without looking away from them. He said, "I've watched you work for 16 years. Gerald used to say you were the only person he knew who could walk into a room full of things and come out knowing which one mattered." He said it like it was the most ordinary fact in the world, which was how Gerald said things that were true. Dot did not pick up the envelope yet. Walter said, "That building has been sitting on that road for 30 years waiting for someone to look at it correctly." He lifted his coffee cup. "I'm betting you're that person." She picked up the envelope. She did not count it. She put it in her coat pocket. She poured the tea that the kettle had finished making, and they sat at the table while the dark came fully down outside, and Walter talked about the screech owl and whether it was the same one as last year or a different one, and whether owls returned to the same hollow once they had established it as viable. And Dot listened and drank her tea and thought about 4 stories of dark granite rising above the tree line on County Road 6, and a price that was less a reflection of value than a reflection of everything everyone had decided to believe about what the building was. That night, she did not sleep until after 2, not from anxiety, from the particular restlessness of a mind that has been handed material that it cannot stop working with the way certain problems in an assessment would not release her until she had followed them to their conclusion, even if the conclusion was simply that more information was required. She thought about this building's history, which she knew in the general outline that any longtime county resident would know. She thought about the Prescott family, which had been part of the region's economic landscape in the railroad era, and had then gradually retreated from that landscape until only Roland III remained, and then not even him. She thought about what a family like that might have accumulated across 3 generations of a certain kind of wealth, the discreet kind, the kind that did not announce itself. She thought about the cellar that a building of that size and that era would contain. She thought about the difference between looking and seeing. She did not think about Daniel's legal pad and color-coded tabs. She decided not to, and the decision held, which was something she had always been good at. In the morning, she called the county property office. The county clerk who handled the Prescott paperwork was a woman named Annette, who had the competence of someone who had processed enough unusual transactions that unusual had become just another category requiring the same forms in the same order as everything else. The conditions of the transfer were what Dot had expected, as is no representations, full liability to the buyer, no recourse, no refunds. Whatever the property contained and whatever condition it was in at the moment, the deed transferred was the buyer's to manage. 2 previous buyers had visited the property before declining. Annette said this without emphasis as a fact rather than a warning, but the implication was clear enough. Dot asked if she could see the property before signing. Annette said she could. There was a pause while Annette reviewed something on her screen. She said that the county was processing offers in the order received and that there had been some recent inquiries from parties she was not at liberty to detail, and that she wanted Dot to have accurate information about the situation. Dot said she understood. She signed. She told herself into the county parking lot with the signed papers in her bag that this was not impulsiveness. It had no resemblance to impulsiveness. It was the same kind of decision she had made dozens of times across a 35-year career. The decision to commit to an assessment you had already made rather than seeking additional confirmation for something you already knew. She had already assessed the building. She had done it across 16 years of driving County Road 6. She had done it through the knowledge of what buildings of that era and that construction quality contain. She had done it through 35 years of understanding that the value of a thing and the appearance of a thing were connected only by accident, and that the accident occurred far less often than most people assumed. She had also done it because she was 69 years old with $71,000 in debt, and a guardianship petition moving through the county court system, and a ruin with her name on the deed was different in kind from a house that someone else controlled. She took the bus to County Road 6. She walked the half-mile from the stop. She had seen Prescott Manor from the road for 16 years. She had never seen it from this side of the gate. The iron fencing ran along the road frontage for perhaps 200 feet. The posts sunk deep in a century and a quarter of New England weather, the pickets still vertical, and even in a way that suggested the original installation had been done with seriousness. The gate at the entrance was a double structure of wrought iron in a design that had been fashionable in 1887 and that had since acquired the additional quality of having lasted, which no design could plan for, but which time occasionally granted. It stood open, seized in that position by rust and years, the gap wide enough to pass through sideways. She went through sideways and stood at the near end of what had been a formal carriage drive and looked at the building. She had thought she knew what it looked like. She had been wrong in the way that you are wrong about something you have seen only at a distance, the model in your mind being accurate in its outline and incorrect in its scale. It was larger than she had understood. 4 stories of granite rose directly from the frozen ground. No transitional steps, no portico to soften the approach. Just stone beginning at the earth and rising without apology to the roofline 4 stories above. The stone was not the gray of ordinary granite. It was darker, the deep charcoal of a particular quarry composition that had absorbed a century and a half of New England weather and been changed by it into something that was neither the original stone color nor the sky color, but a third thing, its own thing, a darkness that was not absence of light, but presence of time. The vines had taken the south face entirely. From the foundation to the base of the third-floor windows, a dense lattice of dormant growth covered the stone in an unbroken gray-brown skin so interlocked and layered that it had ceased to be vegetation and had become something more like geology, a secondary surface the building had grown rather than built. In spring, Dot knew it would green. In summer, it would flower. In winter, it was a texture of bare stems that moved slightly in the November wind and gave the building from a certain angle the impression of slow respiration. The northeast tower rose from the building's corner to a height above the main roof line, 4 stories plus the height of the tower proper, which he estimated at another 30 feet. It had been built with a conical roof of slate, most of which remained the missing sections, showing the exposed timber structure beneath, like a wound that had been weather-sealed rather than healed. The lean was perceptible from where she stood. Not dramatic, perhaps 4 degrees from vertical, perhaps 5. Enough to be visible. Enough to communicate that the process that had produced it was ongoing. The collapsed east wing was the most immediate evidence of catastrophic loss. But standing here looking at it directly rather than from the road, she revised her understanding of the collapse. The exterior wall of the east wing still stood for most of its length, the roof and the interior floors having failed and fallen inward, leaving the wall itself as a kind of container for the debris of its own structure. The window openings in that wall were intact, the lintels holding the masonry around them sound. The collapse had been of the internal structure, not the envelope. The walls were still there. The main entrance was double doors set into a carved granite arch. One door listed inward from a failed upper hinge, its weight resting at an angle against the frame. Through the gap, the darkness of the interior was visible, not the absolute dark of a sealed space, but the dim, filtered dark of a space that received light from multiple directions, none of which were directed enough to illuminate. She looked at the building for a long time. She looked at it the way she had always looked at things that required genuine assessment, without preconception, without the urgency that distorted seeing into the confirmation of what you had already decided you would find. She looked at it the way you looked at a thing you were trying to understand rather than a thing you were trying to justify. What she saw was what it was. The walls were standing. The foundation was granite original set in the 1880s by craftsmen who had understood that the ground in New England moved and had built accordingly deep footings and fitted stone, and the understanding that the relationship between a building and the earth it rested on was a negotiation that lasted as long as the building did. The roof had failed in places. The east wing was gone in the sense that its function was gone. The tower was in progress toward a conclusion that had not yet arrived. But the walls were standing. She walked forward. Inside the entrance hall was marble black and white tile in a geometric pattern that had been fashionable in the period of construction and that had survived because marble was not interested in fashion. The tiles were intact, filmed with dust and the particular residue of a space that had been sealed against weather but not against time, intact. The staircase rose from the center of the hall, its banister missing above the second-floor landing, its treads visible and apparently uncompromised. The plasterwork of the ceiling above retained its original design, a central medallion, in 4 corner details in the classical mode damaged in 2 places, where water had come through from above those sections gone to exposed lath, but the rest holding with the stubbornness of lime plaster that had been given time enough to cure properly. She moved through the ground floor in the methodical sequence she used in estate assessments, not looking for anything specific yet, building the map of the building in the way you built a map before you navigated it, by establishing the overall structure before committing to any particular direction. The main reception room, the library with its shelves emptied of books, the shelves themselves still solid, their brackets rusting in a way that showed their age and did not suggest their failure. The dining room, where the ceiling had come down in a single coherent collapse, the plaster lying in large fragments on the floor below, as if it had decided to descend all at once, rather than piece by piece, which suggested it had held until a single failure point gave way, rather than deteriorating gradually. The oak floors throughout their finish gone, their surface roughened by exposure and neglect, but the boards themselves, the old-growth material from a time when lumber was cut from trees that had spent 200 years achieving the density required to make a floor worth the name. She tested every board before she stepped on it. Every one held. She was in the kitchen when she saw the door. The kitchen was at the rear of the ground floor, positioned in the practical manner of its era, close to the service entrance, oriented to function rather than aesthetics. The original range was gone, removed at some point in the building's history, leaving the flue connection in the exterior wall and a gap where the range had stood. The counters along two walls were slate-heavy and dark, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use and then left to accumulate the dust and stillness that follows disuse. But the slate itself was as intact as the day it was laid. Slate did not compromise. It simply waited. The door was in the rear wall. It was set between the end of the slate counter in the corner of the room, in a position that was architecturally unremarkable and physically easy to miss. It had been painted the same color as the surrounding wall, a shade of slate gray, that the wall had been painted at some point in the building's history, and the painting had been done with enough care that the seam where the door frame met the surrounding plaster was visible only at a specific angle of light, where the slight difference in the surface texture of wood and plaster caught the gray afternoon differently. Someone had painted that door on purpose, not to hide it in the dramatic sense, not to create a secret in the theatrical sense, but in the quieter and more deliberate sense of a person who wanted a door to be overlooked by people who were not looking for it. The distinction mattered. It was the difference between concealment and discretion, between hiding something and simply not advertising it. Dot stood in front of the door and looked at it. The handle was an iron loop, the kind that required lifting before pulling. It had been painted over as well, but the paint had cracked along the pivot point where the mechanism operated, revealing the iron beneath. She stood there for a full minute. She had learned across 35 years that certain moments require preparation. Not because the thing behind the door was dangerous, but because it might be significant. And she had learned that significance wasted on the unprepared was the same as significance wasted entirely. You had one opportunity to encounter a thing for the first time. That encounter deserved to happen at the pace it required. She went back through the kitchen and the dining room and the entrance hall, and out through the front door and down the path and through the gate into the road. She walked to the convenience store she had passed on the way in a half-mile in the direction of town. She bought a flashlight for $1.75, which left her with $4.26. She bought a bottle of water because she had been walking for 2 hours and the cold dried the air and her throat was dry. She walked back. She went through the gate, up the path, through the entrance, through the hall, through the kitchen. She stood in front of the door. She lifted the iron loop. She pulled. The door opened with the resistance that long sealed things open, with not the mechanical resistance of a stiff hinge, but the atmospheric resistance of two spaces that had been separated for a very long time and were now reluctantly rejoining. The equalization of pressure was perceptible against her face as the gap widened, a breath of cool air moving out through the opening, touching her forehead and her cheeks, carrying with it the smell of stone and deep earth, the mineral coolness of a space that had been sealed away from seasons long enough to have forgotten what seasons were. Below the door was a staircase, stone steps broad and fitted descending into darkness. The walls on either side were dressed granite, not rough fieldstone, but work stone cut and fitted with the same quality of intention she had seen in the exterior walls. Someone had built this staircase to be permanent. Someone had understood that what it led to required a descent that was worthy of the destination. She pointed the flashlight down. The beam reached perhaps 12 steps before the darkness absorbed it. She went down. At the bottom, she turned the flashlight in a slow arc. She had been in many cellars. She had been in the storage spaces of great houses and modest houses, and houses that had been great once and become modest, and she had learned to read them the way she read all collections quickly first, for overall character, and then slowly for the details that changed the assessment. She read this one quickly. It was larger than she had expected. It extended beneath not just the main structure above, but outward in the direction of the collapsed east wing, the stone vaulting of the ceiling intact above her, despite whatever had failed at the surface level. The floor was fitted granite, worn smooth by time, absolutely solid. The ceiling was low but not oppressively so. The air was cold and still and carried that mineral sweetness she had caught on the stairs deepened, now concentrated the smell of a space that had been holding something for a very long time. Along the walls ran shelving. Heavy wooden shelving, very old, the wood darkened by age and sealed air to something close to black. Iron brackets, not decorative functional, the kind made by hand, each one individual, the work of someone who understood load and had built accordingly. The shelves ran along three walls, upper and lower and middle register, perhaps 40 feet of shelving total, perhaps more. The shelves were not empty. Crates on the lower shelves, wooden fitted lids stacked too deep in places. Fabric-wrapped objects on the upper shelves, their shapes rectangular, their edges suggesting frames, their spacing deliberate in a way that communicated care rather than storage. Glass-fronted wooden cases with brass fittings along the middle shelves, their lids sealed with wax along the edges. Objects wrapped individually in cloth on the remaining shelf space, each one given its own place, each one given the room it required. And against the far wall, positioned not in a corner, not pushed aside, not overlooked, but placed with the particular deliberateness of something that was meant to be the last thing a person found, an iron box. Its lid was fitted with a hasp. Its lock was the deep rust orange of metal that had oxidized over decades in sealed air. It sat on the stone floor against the far wall, at the center of that wall, not to the left, not to the right, but at the center, the way you place something you intend to be found. Dot stood in the center of the cellar and turned the flashlight in a full slow circle. She had 35 years behind her eyes. 35 years of learning to look at things without projecting onto them what she hoped to see or feared to find. 35 years of the discipline required to let the object speak rather than making it say what was convenient. The object spoke, not to her hope, not to her fear, to the part of her that had spent 35 years learning the difference between things that were what they appeared to be and things that were something else entirely. She went to the nearest crate on the eye-level shelf. She worked the lid up at the corners, her fingertips finding the edge of the wood where it met the groove, the seal of dry years giving with a sound that was small and absolute in the cellar's silence. Inside, packed in material that had dried beyond identification, but that had once been designed to protect, were objects wrapped in cloth. She lifted the nearest one and felt its weight settle into her palm. She unwrapped it slowly. The cloth came away in layers that had fused slightly over time, releasing as she worked them back, and what emerged was a ceramic vessel, perhaps 6 inches in height. Its surface covered in a glaze of deep cobalt blue against white, a design of scrolling botanical forms and geometric borders executed with a precision that was not decorative ambition. It was technical mastery. The kind of technical mastery that came from a tradition that had spent centuries understanding the relationship between the mineral content of a glaze and the temperature of a kiln and the particular quality of the clay body that received both. Dot's hand stopped. She held the piece in the beam of the flashlight and looked at the glaze. She looked at the way the cobalt had been applied in layers, each layer fractionally different in its depth of color, the layers working together to create a blue that had a quality of dimensionality of depth that a single application could never produce. She looked at the border design. She looked at the form of the vessel, the proportion of the foot to the body to the neck, the slight asymmetry that was not imprecision, but the natural consequence of handwork at the highest level of craft. She turned the piece over. The base had a mark. She brought the flashlight directly above it. She did not have her loop. She had a $75 flashlight in 35 years, and the 35 years told her what she needed to know. The mark confirmed a period in a workshop that she had written about in a journal article in 2001, a workshop that had operated for less than 30 years and whose output had entered major collections across 2 continents, and whose authenticated pieces had not appeared at public auction in a decade because there were almost none left in private hands. The workshop had operated under the Yongjing Emperor. The piece she was holding was 300 years old. It had been in a cellar in New Hampshire. Dorothea Finch stood in the dark beneath Prescott Manor, and her hands, which had remained steady through the conference room and the petition and the bank statements, in 13 months of managing the weight of loss with the controlled efficiency she had learned over a lifetime. Her hands, without her instruction, began to shake. Not from cold, not from fear, from the particular physical response that the body makes when the mind arrives at a certainty too large to hold in the ordinary way and must redistribute the weight of it through the available systems. She sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. She turned the flashlight off. She sat in the dark of a sealed cellar beneath a 4-story granite ruin that her son had not yet been told she owned, and she held a 300-year-old piece of porcelain in her lap in the dark, and she breathed. The cellar was absolutely silent. The cold of it was the cold of stone that had never known a furnace vent, the permanent cold of earth at a depth where the seasons did not reach constant, ancient, indifferent to what happened at the surface. She sat in that silence for a long time. She thought about Gerald. 13 months. 13 months since she had stood at the graveside on a November morning with her hands at her sides and her face still, while Patricia cried and Daniel held Patricia's arm, and the minister said the words that ministers said, and the wind moved through the bare birches above the cemetery in the way it moved at this time of year, with a directness that felt personal without being so. She had not fallen apart. Not in the parking lot when Patricia asked her to. Not in the weeks after when people came with food and the particular careful consideration of people who were waiting to see how she would manage. Not in the 4 months since the last round of bills had arrived and the arithmetic of the situation had become undeniable. She had not fallen apart because the list of what needed to be done had been assembling itself since the morning Gerald was admitted for the last time. And she had learned across 69 years that the list was what you held when nothing else was holdable. She thought about what it would mean if the rest of the shelves held what this piece suggested they held. She thought about the iron box against the far wall and why it had been placed at the center of the far wall and what that placement communicated about the person who had put it there. She thought about Roland Prescott, who had lived alone in a 4-story granite house for the last decades of his life, who had declined to receive visitors, and who had been described by the few people who had known him as private in the way that some people were private as a matter of principle rather than temperament. She thought about a man like that and what a man like that might have spent his solitary decades doing, and what he might have assembled in the doing of it, and what it meant that he had assembled it here below the floor in a cellar built to last. She turned the flashlight back on. She wrapped the piece in its cloth, the layers going back in the same sequence they had come off the cloth receiving the object, the way it had held it for however long it had been here. She placed it back in the crate. She replaced the lid. She stood up. She looked at the shelves. She counted the crates she could see immediately. She counted the wrapped bundles on the upper shelves. She looked at the sealed wooden cases. She looked at the iron box. She did not open anything else. Not tonight, not yet. She had enough. She had what she needed to understand the scale of what this was, and she had the discipline to not rush past that understanding into something she was not yet prepared to handle correctly. She went back up the stairs. She closed the cellar door behind her and stood in the kitchen with both hands flat on the slate counter and breathed twice evenly through her nose. Her hands were not shaking anymore. The November light through the kitchen window was the thin, directionless light of late afternoon in New Hampshire in early November, the kind of light that was present without illuminating, that filled the room without making it bright. It fell across the slate counter and the empty space where the range had been, and the closed cellar door, and Dot standing at the counter with her hands on the stone. She thought Gerald. She thought, "You always said I could walk into a room full of things and come out knowing which one mattered." She pressed her hands harder against the slate. She thought I found it. Then she picked up her bag and walked through the kitchen and through the dining room and through the entrance hall and out through the front door and down the flagstone path and through the iron gate sideways, her coat catching on the latch in the same place as before, and she walked to County Road 6 in the last of the failing light. She stood at the road's edge and did not look back. But she was aware of it behind her in the way you are aware of something that has changed in your life before you have fully found the language for the change. The building stood in the dark above the tree line with its 4 stories of granite and its leaning tower and its breath of mineral cold rising from below the painted door, and it was hers. $340, $71,000 in debt, a guardianship petition moving through the system, a conference room and color-coded tabs and her son's careful handwriting on a legal pad. And beneath the collapsed east wing, in the sagging roof line, and the vines that had made themselves a second skin on the south face of the building, beneath all of it, in a stone cellar built by someone who understood permanence as a commitment rather than a hope, a collection was waiting. It had been waiting for a very long time. It had been waiting for the person who would know what it was in the first 15 seconds. The bus came. Dot got on. She rode back toward a town through the dark countryside, and she sat with her hands in her lap and the flashlight in her bag and $4.26 in her coat pocket, and she thought about nothing and everything, and the lights of other people's houses moved past the window in the dark, warm yellows in the cold, and she watched them pass and she breathed. She had work to do. Now she knew what it was. She called Marion Webb on a Thursday morning 9 days after she signed the papers at the county office. She had waited 9 days deliberately, not from hesitation, from the understanding that what she had found in the cellar beneath Prescott Manor required a particular kind of witness, and that finding the right witness required more care than finding a witness quickly. She had spent those 9 days doing what she could alone. She had gone back to the manor every morning after Walter dropped her at the County Road 6 stop. She had gone through the cellar with the methodical patience she had applied to every estate assessment across 35 years, photographing each shelf, each crate, each wrapped bundle, each sealed case with the camera on her phone, until the storage filled and she had to transfer files to the secondhand laptop she kept on the kitchen table at Aldermore Road. She did not open everything. She opened enough to understand the shape of what was there, and the shape was large enough that opening everything alone would have been. She recognized a form of recklessness she could not afford. Some things required expertise beyond her own. Some things required a second set of eyes that had spent as many years as hers learning to distinguish between what a thing appeared to be and what it was. Marion Webb was 57 years old. She had been the senior cataloger at the Whitfield Estate Appraisers in Manchester when Dot had been brought in as an outside consultant in 1994, and the two of them had spent 3 weeks in a house in Exeter working through the contents of a collection that had not been properly assessed in 40 years. They had found in those 3 weeks 4 objects that required immediate escalation to specialist consultants and 7 that required escalation to institutions. They had also found in the process of that work a respect for each other's eye that neither of them had articulated and neither of them had needed to. They had stayed in irregular contact since. A phone call when one of them encountered something that wanted a second opinion. A note when an attribution they had both debated in 1994 was finally settled by an auction house in 2003. The particular form of professional friendship that survives in the gaps between contact rather than requiring maintenance. Dot had not called Marion in 4 years. Marion answered on the second ring. Dot said, "I have something I need you to look at." Marion said where Dot gave her the address. There was a silence on Marion's end that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Marion said she had a commitment in Portsmouth on Friday that she could not move and that she could be in Aldermore on Saturday morning if that suited. Dot said Saturday suited. She did not tell Marion what was in the cellar. She had decided this with the same deliberateness that governed most of her decisions, which was that an assessment made without preconception was a more reliable assessment than one made with expectations already formed. She wanted Marion's first response to be her own response, unconditioned by what Dot had told her to expect. Marion Webb arrived on a Saturday at 9 in the morning in a dark blue Volvo that was practical and well-maintained in the way of someone who understood that a car was a tool and maintained their tools. She parked on the road outside the gap in the iron fence and came through the gate with a bag on each shoulder, one canvas and one leather, and stood at the foot of the formal drive and looked at Prescott Manor with the expression Dot had been waiting to see. It was the expression of a professional encountering something whose scale exceeded the category she had prepared for. Marion stood for a full minute without speaking. She looked at the 4 stories of dark granite, the vines on the south faced the leaning tower, the ragged eastern edge where the wing had gone. She looked at the building the way Dot had looked at it the first time, with the understanding that the model she had constructed from the address and the description was insufficient and needed to be replaced with what was actually standing in front of her. Then she looked at Dot. She said, "How long has it been empty?" Dot said. "Since 2021 officially. Before that, the last occupant was alone here for at least 30 years and not receiving visitors." Marion looked at the building again. She said, "And you bought it." Dot said, "I bought it." Marion said, "For how much?" Dot said, $250. Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her bags and said, "Show me." They went through the building the way Dot had gone through it the first time, in the methodical sequence of people who understood that understanding a space required covering it completely before focusing anywhere in particular. Marion moved through the ground floor with the trained efficiency of her work, her eyes going to the ceiling details, the floor condition, the state of the windows, the evidence of water damage and its extent, but also, in Dot watched for this, to the shapes of what remained on the shelves and the surfaces, reading the residue of occupation for what it communicated about the person who had done the occupying. She said little. This was consistent with the Marion that Dot remembered from Exeter in 1994. Marion's silence during an initial assessment was not absence of thought. It was the presence of too much thought to permit speech. In the library, she stopped at the empty shelves and ran one finger along a shelf surface and looked at what the finger collected and said, "He had books here. A great many books. The weight marks on the shelving are consistent with full loading for a long time." Dot said he apparently sent them to a university library in Vermont the year before he died. "A bequest." Marion said, "A man who plans his bequests." She said it in the tone of someone filing information. They went through the kitchen and Marion registered the slate counters in the ghost of the removed range, in the light from the single unboarded window, and said nothing until she saw the door in the rear wall, and then she stopped. She looked at the door and its paint and its iron loop handle and the barely perceptible seam where the frame met the surrounding plaster, and something shifted in her expression in a way that Dot recognized, because it was the same shift that had happened in her own expression when she had found it 11 days ago. She said, "He painted it to match." Dot said yes. Marion said, "That's not renovation carelessness. That's a decision." Dot said yes. Marion looked at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and in the silence of the kitchen, with the November light coming through the one window and the stone of the building around them, there was the particular quality of two people who had spent their lives learning to read objects, understanding simultaneously that they were standing in front of the most significant object either of them had encountered. Dot lifted the iron loop. She pulled. The door opened with the same atmospheric resistance as before, the cold air rising, the mineral darkness coming up the stairs to meet them. Marion unzipped the leather bag and removed a flashlight that was considerably more substantial than the $1.75 model in Dot's coat pocket a professional instrument with a beam that could be adjusted in its width and its intensity. She clicked it on and pointed it down the stairs. She went down first, which Dot had not expected but did not question. She followed. Marion moved through the cellar the way Dot had known she would, which was the way that Dot herself moved through a space that required genuine assessment, slowly and without urgency covering the ground, in a sequence that built from the general to the specific, without skipping the general to get to what looked most immediately interesting. She went to the shelves first. She looked at the overall arrangement, the crates and the bundles, in the sealed cases, the spacing and the organization, and what the organization communicated about the person who had done it. She did not open anything yet. She walked the length of the shelves with her flashlight moving in steady arcs, and she looked and she said nothing. Then she went back to the first crate on the eye-level shelf and opened it. She worked the lid up with the same corner-first method Dot had used. She reached in and lifted one of the cloth-wrapped objects and unwrapped it with a care that was not slowness, but precision, the cloth coming away in layers, and the ceramic piece emerging into the beam of her flashlight. She looked at it for a long time. She turned it over. She looked at the base mark. She brought the flashlight to within 2 inches of the surface and held it there without moving. Then she wrapped the piece back and replaced it and replaced the lid, and she moved to the next crate. Dot watched. She had positioned herself near the stairs with her own flashlight, and she watched Marion work, and what she watched for was the moment when Marion's body communicated what her face was being careful not to. She had watched for this in Exeter in 1994, and she had watched for it across 35 years of her own assessments, and she knew what it looked like when a professional's body understood something that the professional's professional composure was working to process before expressing. Marion's hand slowed on the third crate. That was the moment. Not a stop, not a tremor, simply a fractional reduction in the pace of movement, the body's response to encountering something that required the system to allocate more resources to the present moment. She moved through 4 crates in the first hour. She moved to the fabric-wrapped bundles on the upper shelves and unwrapped 3 of them, fully laying the cloth aside on the shelf below, with a care that communicated that the cloth was not incidental but protective, and that she intended to return each piece to exactly the condition she had found it. The first bundle was a frame, a painting, small, perhaps 12 inches by 16 oil on canvas, a landscape in the tradition that Dot associated with a particular Northern European school of the mid-20th century, the particular quality of the light in the composition, the restraint of the palette, the way the horizon was placed in the canvas at a position that was mathematically specific in a way that took training to recognize. Marion looked at it for a very long time. She turned it over and examined the back of the canvas in the frame construction and the stamps and marks that had accumulated on the reverse over the years. The provenance stamps of the institutions and collections, a work passed through the chalk marks and stickers and labels that were their own form of biography. She looked at those marks the way Dot had seen people look at things they were trying to remain calm about. She wrapped the painting and replaced it and said in a voice that was level in the particular way of a voice that is working at being level, "I'm going to need to make some calls before I can tell you anything with certainty." Dot said, "I know." Marion moved to the sealed wooden cases with the brass fittings, working the sealed edges carefully with a blade she produced from her bag, the wax yielding along the seam without damage to what lay beneath. She spent 40 minutes on the contents of the first case. She did not describe what she found. She photographed everything with a camera she removed from the canvas bag, working in silence with the systematic coverage of someone who understood that documentation was not supplementary to assessment, but intrinsic to it. She went to the iron box last. She crouched in front of it and looked at the hasp and the lock and the positioning of the box against the wall, the deliberate centering of it that Dot had noticed on her first visit. She looked at it without touching it for a long time. Then she removed from her bag a tool that Dot recognized as a tension wrench, and pick set the kind used by locksmiths and by professionals who encountered locked boxes with enough frequency to have learned the practical solution. She worked the lock. The rust made it slow. She worked it with patience and without forcing it, understanding that forcing a mechanism that had corroded was the way to damage what you were trying to open. The lock gave after perhaps 8 minutes with a sound that was small and clear in the cellar silence, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Marion opened the box. She spent a long time inside it. Dot could not see the contents from where she stood. She did not move closer. She had understood from the moment Marion arrived that the assessment was Marion's to conduct in Marion's sequence, and that her role was to have provided the access and to now stay out of the way of the work. After perhaps 15 minutes, Marion stood. She closed the iron box. She turned and looked at Dot, and for the first time since she had arrived, her expression was entirely unguarded. The professional composure was still there, but beneath it, visible through it, was something that Dot recognized as the expression of a person who has encountered something they had not prepared to encounter. Marion said, "I need to make calls before I can tell you anything with certainty, and I need to bring someone with me when I come back." She said it carefully, which meant she was choosing words with care, which meant the words she was choosing were standing in for words she was not yet ready to say. Dot said, "All right." Marion looked at the cellar. She looked at the shelving and the crates and the bundles and the sealed cases and the iron box she had just closed. She looked at it in a way that was not a look for assessment, but a look for comprehension, the look of someone trying to hold a thing in its full size. She said, "Dot, this space needs to remain exactly as it is. No one comes in here without my knowledge. No one is told about this. Can you manage that?" Dot said, "I've been managing it alone for 11 days. Marion looked at her. She said, "Yes, I suppose you have." They went back up the stairs and out through the kitchen and through the building and out into the cold afternoon, and Marion put her bags in the Volvo and sat for a moment in the driver's seat before she started the engine, and Dot stood on the drive and watched her and Marion look through the windshield at the building for a long time. Then she started the engine and drove to the road and turned toward town. Dot stood in the drive for a moment with the iron gate behind her and Prescott Manor in front of her, and the November sky above them both. She stood there and breathed. Then she went home. The letter from Alderton and Pierce arrived on a Tuesday. It came addressed to the county property office with a copy forwarded to Dot at the Aldermore Road address, and it arrived with the particular authority of a document generated by a firm that understood that the weight of presentation was itself a form of argument. The firm's letterhead was Boston. The paper was heavy stock. The language was precise and formal in the way of legal language that has been prepared by someone who expected it to be read carefully by people who would be looking for weaknesses. The letter stated that Alderton and Pierce represented the interests of the Prescott family estate in the matter of the property at County Road 6 transferred by the County of Merrimack in November of the current year. It stated that the family believed the transfer to have been executed without full compliance with the statutory requirements governing the disposal of estate property with potential historical and cultural significance. It stated that they were prepared to contest the validity of the transfer in the appropriate venue if a satisfactory resolution could not be reached through other means. It stated that they would appreciate a response within 15 business days. Dot read the letter twice at the kitchen table with the morning coffee going cold beside her. She read it without the shock that the letter might have intended to produce, because she had understood from the first day that the building was what she believed it to be. Someone else would eventually understand it too, and that understanding would not arrive in the form of a compliment. She called Jeffrey Alcott. She had found Alcott's name through a referral chain that had started with a call to the New Hampshire Bar Association's referral line and had passed through 2 intermediary recommendations before arriving at him, a process she had conducted 3 days after signing the papers, because she had understood then that whatever was in that cellar was going to require legal architecture more substantial than what an individual could manage alone. Alcott was 53, a partner in a firm in Concord that specialized in estate law and property transactions, and he had the quality that Dot had decided was the first requirement in a lawyer, which was that he listened completely before he spoke, rather than beginning to construct his response while she was still constructing hers. She told him about the letter. He said he would need to see it. He said she should not respond to it herself. He said the 15 business day window was designed to create pressure rather than to reflect genuine urgency, and that the appropriate response to that kind of pressure was a measured one rather than a reactive one. He said, "Do you know where the alleged heirs were when the county was trying to dispose of this property for 3 years?" Dot said she did not. He said, "Neither do I, but I'm going to find out." She faxed him the letter from the copy shop on Garrison Street. She walked back to Aldermore Road in the cold and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the iron box and the documents Marion had found inside it. She thought about whatever Marion had seen in those documents that had produced the expression she had allowed herself briefly at the bottom of the cellar stairs. The documents in the iron box were the things she was not yet thinking about directly. She was approaching them the way she approached a piece in an assessment that she could see was significant before she had established the grounds for the significance. She was building the frame first. She would put the object in the frame when the frame was ready. The phone rang at 4 in the afternoon. It was Daniel. He had heard about the letter from Patricia, who had heard from a friend who worked in the county property office, which was how things traveled in a county of this size, through the proximity of people who knew each other's business without being invited into it. His voice on the phone was not angry. That was what she noticed first. It was the voice of someone who had decided before calling that he was not going to be angry, which was its own kind of signal. He said he had heard as she had purchased a property. She said she had. He said he had also heard that there was some legal complexity around the purchase. She said there was a letter from a firm in Boston claiming to represent Prescott family interests and that she had an attorney who was handling it. There was a pause. He said, "Mom, you don't have the resources to manage a legal dispute right now." She said, "I'm aware of my resources, Daniel." He said, "I'm not trying to make this about the guardianship. I'm trying to say that if there are people who want to contest this purchase, and if what you bought isn't worth the legal cost of defending the purchase, then it might be worth understanding that before you get further in." Dot was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the kitchen window. Outside, the light was going. The birch at the corner of the property had shed its remaining leaves in the windstorm the previous week and stood bare and white against the darkening sky. Its branches held in the particular upward angle of birches that looked like an argument made by something that did not intend to be dismissed. She said, "Daniel, how many years did you watch me work?" He said, "Mom." She said, "How many years?" The answer is 22 years from the time you were old enough to understand what I did until the time you moved to Portland. 22 years. He said, "I know." She said, "In 22 years, did I ever purchase something without understanding what it was?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "In 35 years of professional practice, did I ever fail to correctly identify the value of what I was assessing?" He said quietly, "No." She said, "What's in that building is real, Daniel. The people who want to contest it are people who looked at the same property I looked at and concluded it wasn't worth their time. They're changing their conclusion now because someone told them something changed, and the thing that changed is that I signed papers." She paused. "Go ahead and look into it if you need to, but understand that you're going to find out you should have trusted me." She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table in the failing light and pressed both hands flat on the table's surface and held them there, feeling the wood cool and solid and present. She had said more than she had intended to say. She had said it because it was true and because there was a particular exhaustion in containing a truth long enough that the container developed stress fractures, and because Daniel was her son, and the people who were permitted to hear the things she contained were a very short list. She thought about what it had meant to sit in that conference room and watch him present his color-coded tabs and his careful handwriting and his deep, genuine belief that he was doing the right thing for someone who had lost the ability to do the right thing for herself. She thought about the cellar and the iron box and the 300-year-old piece of porcelain she had held in the dark. She thought about how the same set of eyes could look at the same thing and see entirely different objects depending on what those eyes had learned to see. She picked up the phone and called Jeffrey Alcott back. She said, "My son may be in contact with Alderton and Pierce, not as an adversary, as someone they might persuade that I need to be protected from my own decisions." Alcott was quiet for a moment. He said, Has he spoken to you about the guardianship petition today? She said he hasn't mentioned it directly, but Daniel doesn't do things one at a time. Alcott said, I'll file a formal response to Alderton and Pierce by end of week. In the meantime, I want you to do nothing. No contact with them. No contact with anyone who might be affiliated with them. Nothing that generates a paper trail we haven't constructed deliberately. She said, I understand that. He said, the property documentation from the county transfer is clean. I've reviewed it. The transfer was properly executed under the applicable statute. Their argument about historical and cultural significance is going to require them to demonstrate that the county had a specific obligation that was not met, which is going to be very difficult given the condition of the property at the time of transfer and the 3 years they did nothing while it was available to purchase. He paused. He said, but Mrs. Finch, they prepared this quickly. The letter arrived less than 2 weeks after the deed transferred. Someone was watching that property. She said, I know. He said, which means someone knew there was a reason to watch it. She said, I know that too. Marion called on a Wednesday morning 12 days after her visit to the manor. Dot was in the kitchen at the table with coffee and the physical therapy exercises the doctor had prescribed for her left shoulder, which she had been performing with less regularity than prescribed, because the regularity required remembering to do them, and remembering to do them required a portion of her daily attention that was currently allocated to other things. She answered on the first ring. Marion's voice was the same voice it had been when they worked together in Exeter in 1994. Direct, unhurried. The voice of someone for whom the communication of accurate information was a value in itself rather than an instrument of impression. She said she had been in contact with 3 colleagues. She said she had sent photographs and specifications to a colleague in New York who specialized in Chinese decorative arts, to a colleague in Philadelphia who specialized in European manuscripts, and to a colleague in Amsterdam. The colleagues in New York and Philadelphia had responded within 72 hours with the request for additional photographs and dimensions which Marion had obtained by returning to the manor the previous Thursday, while Dot was at Alcott's office, for which she apologized, and which Dot said was entirely all right. She said the colleague in Amsterdam had responded in 36 hours. She said this the way she said most things, as a fact. But Dot heard beneath the fact the weight of what 36 hours meant. She had been in this work long enough to know what speed of response communicated in the network of specialists who did not respond quickly to anything that did not require their most immediate attention. Marion said, there is a painting in the collection, a landscape, small canvas oil. I sent him the photographs of the front and the reverse, including the provenance stamps. She paused. She said, one of those stamps matches a stamp used by a collection in the Netherlands that was dispersed in 1943. The collection was partially documented before the dispersal. The documentation survived. The painting did not, or it was believed not to have survived. Dot was very still. Marion said he wants to examine it in person. He's prepared to come to New Hampshire. That is not something he does for pieces he is not already substantially confident about. He referred me to a database of works lost in the dispersals of that period, and the entry for this painting describes dimensions and palette and compositional structure that are consistent in every particular with what I photographed. Dot said, what is the entry's estimated value? Marion said the database doesn't carry current market valuations. But I spoke with an auction specialist in New York who works in this category. She said that a work of this attribution and provenance in this condition coming to market with documentation establishing the ownership chain clearly would be expected to realize between $160 and $210 million at current market conditions. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee had gone cold. The light through the window was the thin winter light of November in New Hampshire, flat and directionless, the kind of light that illuminated without warming. Dot said, that's one piece. Marion said, yes. Dot said, and the ceramics. Marion said, my colleague in New York described the photographs I sent as, and I'm quoting him exactly, among the most significant material I have seen in private hands in 30 years of this work. He used the word significant twice in the same message, which he does not do. The preliminary read on three of the pieces I photographed places them in a category of rarity that makes comparative valuation difficult because there is almost nothing comparable against which to set them. Dot said Marion. Marion said yes. Dot said the sealed cases, the manuscripts. Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my colleague in Philadelphia has not yet responded with a preliminary assessment. What he has responded with is a request to speak by telephone, which he followed with a second message saying he would prefer to speak in person. He is in Philadelphia. He is proposing to drive to New Hampshire. Dot set her coffee cup on the table. She set it down carefully with the deliberateness of someone who was managing several things simultaneously and needed to give her hands something simple to do. She thought about a man in Philadelphia who worked with historical manuscripts deciding to drive to New Hampshire rather than conduct a preliminary conversation by telephone. She thought about what that drive communicated. Marion said, there's something else. I want to tell you about the iron box. Dot said, tell me. Marion said the documents in the box are ownership records, acquisition records, transaction documentation covering the assembly of the collection across a period of approximately 70 years, beginning in the early 1940s. The documentation is in multiple languages, which is consistent with the period and the nature of what was being acquired, and it is meticulous in a way that is unusual even for serious collectors. Every piece has a documented acquisition chain. Every piece has records of where it came from and how it was transferred. She paused. She said, Dot, some of the pieces in that cellar passed through collections that were significant before they came to rest in a cellar in New Hampshire. Not passed through in the sense of black market transactions. Passed through in the sense that the Prescott family acquired them through the means available to American collectors of private means in the middle of the 20th century, means that were legal and documented, and that the records in that box establish in detail. Dot said, the ownership chain is clean. Marion said, from what I can see of it, yes. But that will require proper legal and historical verification. That's not my expertise, and it's beyond what I can certify. You need an attorney who specializes in this kind of estate law, and I can give you a name if you don't have one. Dot said I have one. Marion said, good. She paused again, and in the pause, Dot heard Marion choosing her next words with the care that she applied to things that required it. She said, I want to be clear about something, and I want to say it plainly because I think you've earned that. In 31 years of this work, I have been in a great many significant properties. I have assessed collections that were called extraordinary and that were extraordinary, and collections that were called extraordinary and were not. She stopped. What is in that cellar is the second kind of extraordinary, the real kind, the kind that requires me to revise the frame of reference I brought to the assessment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the birch stood white and bare against the sky. Dot said, how long before you can give me a preliminary written assessment? Marion said, 2 weeks for a preliminary. The full authentication will take months. Some of the pieces will need to travel to facilities where they can be examined under conditions the Manor cannot provide. The painting will need to go to Amsterdam. That process has its own timeline. Dot said, in the total, when you have enough for a preliminary. Marion was quiet for a moment. She said, I don't want to give you a number that collapses under its own weight. I'm not going to do that until I can stand behind it. What I will tell you is that the preliminary figures I'm building from what I've seen so far, with the ceramics and the painting, and what my colleague in New York is indicating about the manuscript cases are figures that are going to require you to make decisions you haven't made before. And I want you to have the right people around you before those numbers become real. She said, call your attorney. Tell him what I've told you. Tell him to start building the framework now before the preliminary numbers arrive. Because once they arrive, everything will move faster than you want it to. Dot said she understood. She thanked Marion. She sat at the kitchen table after the call ended with the phone in her hand, and the cold coffee and the morning light through the window, and the exercises for her shoulder that she had not finished, and she held all of it at once in the way she had learned to hold things that were too large for any single thought. She thought about a cellar in New Hampshire where a painting sat wrapped in cloth that had been protecting it for decades, a painting that a man in Amsterdam would drive to see because he was already substantially confident about what it was. She thought about Prescott Manor standing on County Road 6 in the November cold, its 4 stories of granite and its leaning tower and its vines and its collapsed eastern wing. The building that 2 separate buyers had visited and declined, the building that had been carrying a price of $250. Like a deliberate understatement, the way a person sometimes says less than they know because they are waiting for the person who will hear the less and understand the more. She thought about Gerald, about the way he had described her work to people at dinner parties in the tone of someone who was not boasting but was simply stating what he knew to be true. He would say, "She can walk into a room full of things and tell you which one matters." He would say it as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as though the ability were a natural feature of the landscape of their life together, like the birch in the corner of the yard, or the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. She pressed her hand flat on the kitchen table. She thought about what Marion had said, the real kind of extraordinary, the kind that required revising the frame of reference. She thought about Jeffrey Alcott and the letter from Alderton and Pierce and Daniel, who had not yet decided whether to trust her or to protect her from herself, which were in his current understanding the same thing. She thought about $250 and the bus to County Road 6 and a door painted to match the wall around it and an iron loop that required lifting before pulling. She picked up the phone. She called Jeffrey Alcott. She told him what Marion had said. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for her to hear the quality of it, which was the silence of a person adjusting a calculation rather than the silence of a person absorbing a surprise. He said, "I need you to come into the office tomorrow morning." She said, "I'll be there at 9." He said, "Mrs. Finch, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Is there any element of the acquisition of this property that you are uncertain about? Any conversation, any document, any representation made to you that you later questioned?" She said no. He said, "The deed transfer was properly executed. The county had proper authority to sell. You were not misled about the property's condition." She said, "The property's condition was accurately characterized as unknown. I accepted that." He said, "Good." He paused. "The letter from Alderton and Pierce arrived 11 days after you signed. The property had been on the market for 3 years. Someone told them something. Either they had someone watching the property and saw activity, or someone at the county office said something to the wrong person." Dot said, "Or someone who knew what was in the cellar has known for a long time and has been waiting." Alcott was quiet. He said, "Yes. That's the possibility I haven't wanted to say yet." Dot said, "Say it now." He said if the Prescott family had any knowledge of the collection's value and chose not to act on it during the estate settlement, and then chose to act when an outside party acquired the property for a nominal sum, that is a set of facts that a court is going to want to understand very clearly. And it is a set of facts that works in your favor rather than against you, because it raises significant questions about the family's conduct during the estate process. He said, "I'll have a response to Alderton and Pierce filed by Friday. I want you to do nothing between now and then. Don't go back to the property. Don't speak to anyone about the collection. Don't respond to Daniel if he calls again about this." Dot said, "What if he comes in person?" Alcott said, "Then you offer him coffee and you talk about something else." He paused. "Can you do that?" Dot said, "I've been managing things alone for 13 months, Mr. Alcott. I can manage another 72 hours. He said, "I know. I'm asking anyway." She said, "Yes, I can do that." She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table in the kitchen of the house on Aldermore Road, in which Gerald's reading chair was still at the angle he had left it, because she had not yet decided what she thought about moving it. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table and the cold coffee cup in her hands. She thought about a letter from a firm in Boston, prepared within 11 days of a deed transfer for a property that had been available for 3 years. She thought about someone watching. She thought about the cellar and what it held, and the patience required to have held it for so long, and the patience required to hold the knowledge of it now, and whether patience was what the situation required of her, or whether it was simply what the situation had determined was available. She looked at her hands on the table. They were the hands of a 69-year-old woman who had held thousands of objects across 35 years and had not yet failed to identify the one that mattered. She was not going to start now. She got up and finished her coffee and did her shoulder exercises in full all 12 repetitions. And then she went to the secondhand laptop and opened the files she had transferred from her phone and began going through the photographs of the cellar systematically from the first crate to the iron box, looking at each image with the attention she had given to the thing itself, looking for what she had seen and what she had missed. She worked until the light was gone. Then she made dinner and sat at the kitchen table and ate alone, as she had eaten alone for 13 months in the house where all the familiar things were still in their familiar places, unchanged and exact, waiting for a person who was not coming back to notice them. Outside the window, Aldermore Road was dark and quiet. The birch stood at the property's corner, white and bare, held in its upward angle against the night sky. The building on County Road 6 sat in the dark of the countryside 6 miles away, its 4 stories of granite and its painted door and its cellar full of things that were waiting, with the patience of things that had already waited a very long time. Dot cleared her plate. She had 72 hours. She went to bed. Jeffrey Alcott filed the response to Alderton and Pierce on a Friday morning, and by Tuesday of the following week he had received through the appropriate channels a communication from their offices that he described to Dot on the phone as clarifying. He said they filed on the basis of an allegation that the county transfer process failed to comply with a provision of the state statute governing disposal of properties with potential historical or cultural significance. That provision requires a 60-day public notice period before disposal if the property has been nominated for the State Register of Historic Places. He paused. The Prescott property was never nominated. Roland Prescott declined every approach from the Historical Society over a period of approximately 20 years. There is no nomination on record. There is no proceeding on record. There is no basis for the provision they cited. Dot said they didn't know that when they filed. Alcott said, which tells us something. They filed quickly on a theory that seemed plausible without doing the research to confirm the theory. That suggests either significant overconfidence or significant pressure from whoever instructed them to file. Dot said or both. Alcott said or both. He was quiet for a moment. I made some inquiries about the parties Alderton and Pierce are representing. The Prescott family interest in this matter originates with a nephew of Roland Prescott, a man named Burton Graves who lives in Connecticut. He participated in the estate settlement 2 years ago and signed a disclaimer of interest at that time. Dot said he signed away his interest. Alcott said he did, which means that the basis on which Alderton and Pierce are representing him is at minimum questionable. A disclaimer of interest in an estate is not the same as a waiver of standing in all possible subsequent proceedings, but it substantially narrows what he can argue. Their strongest ground would have been the statutory notice argument, and that ground doesn't exist. Without it, they're arguing that a man who signed away his interest has standing to challenge a transfer that occurred 2 years after he did so. He paused. He said, I expect they'll withdraw within 10 days. They withdrew in 6. The letter came on a Thursday with the language of firms that withdraw from untenable positions, correct and formal, and saying nothing about why the position had become untenable. Alcott forwarded it to Dot with a brief note that said, as expected, the property is yours without encumbrance. Call me when Marion has her preliminary numbers. Dot read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with coffee that was still warm, and the shoulder exercises she had this week been performing on schedule, and she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph required a contest of equals, and this had not been that. What she felt was simpler and more fundamental. The recognition that what she had known was what she knew, and that the mechanism that had been deployed to make her doubt that knowledge had been insufficient for the task. She called Jeffrey Alcott and thanked him. She called Marion and told her the legal encumbrance had been resolved. Marion said, "Good, because we need to go back to the manor." Marion came the following Saturday with two people she introduced only by their first names in the manner of professionals who understood that the formality of full introduction could wait until the work was done. Edmund was 61, tall and methodical, and he carried equipment in cases that he handled with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that the objects inside the cases were not replaceable, and that this fact was the first consideration in everything he did. He was the colleague from Amsterdam. He had driven from Boston, where he had flown the previous day, and he had the contained focus of a man who had been thinking about what he was about to see since the photographs arrived in his inbox 17 days ago. Vera was 48, and she moved through the manor with the quality of attention that Dot recognized immediately as manuscript expertise. The particular way that people who work with historical documents looked at a space reading, not the objects, but the conditions, the humidity, the light exposure, the evidence of how a space had been managed over time as a proxy for how the objects within it had been managed. She was the colleague from Philadelphia who had proposed driving to New Hampshire rather than speaking by telephone. Dot led them through the building without commentary. She had come to understand the walk from the entrance to the cellar door as its own kind of ceremony, the passage through the damaged spaces, the entrance hall and the library and the dining room and the kitchen. Each room a chapter in the argument that the building made about what it was and what it had endured and why it was still standing. She walked them through it in silence and let the building make its own argument. At the cellar door, she lifted the iron loop and pulled, and the cold air came up the stairs in its measured ancient way, and Edmund and Vera absorbed it, the way Dot had absorbed it the first time, with the slight adjustment of posture that happened involuntarily when a person understood that they were entering something that preceded them by a significant margin. Edmund set his cases at the base of the stairs and opened them with quiet efficiency. The lighting equipment he produced was professional in a way that the flashlights had not been capable of being positioned and angled and adjusted to eliminate reflections and reveal surfaces at the precise angle required for genuine examination. When he switched it on, the cellar changed. Under the flashlights, the cellar had seemed simply old. Under Edmund's lighting, it seemed curated. The colors of the ceramic pieces on the open crates deepened and separated into their constituent layers, the cobalt revealing its internal dimensionality, the glazed surfaces showing the texture that hand application produced at the level of microscopic irregularity that mechanical production could never replicate. The frames of the wrapped paintings caught the light at their exposed edges with the particular warm authority of gilt that had been applied over gesso laid over wood, the light interacting with each layer in a sequence that was as diagnostic as any mark on the reverse. Vera moved immediately to the sealed wooden cases. She carried her own instruments, including a humidity meter and a fiber optic light source for internal examination, and she worked with the focused silence of someone whose mind was already running far ahead of her hands. Marion moved through the space with the ease of a second visit, covering ground she had already assessed and extending into areas she had photographed but not yet physically examined. Dot stood at the foot of the staircase. She had understood from Marion's first visit that her role here was to have provided access, and that the appropriate response to expertise being applied to something was to stay out of its way and let the expertise work. She used the time to look at the cellar with the quality of attention she had not been able to give it on her first visits, when the newness of everything and the limitations of the flashlight had imposed their own constraints. She looked at the stone floor and the precision with which the granite pieces had been fitted, the joints between them hairline tight, in the manner of work done by someone who understood that the floor of a storage space was not decorative but functional, that what it protected was only as protected as the floor was solid. She looked at the iron brackets on the shelving, each one individually made, each one carrying its load at the angle that distributed the weight correctly, none of them showing the deformation that a bracket would show if it had been asked to carry more than it was designed to manage. She looked at the iron box against the far wall. It had been there for every visit. She had looked at it each time. She had not yet been inside. It had not been inside it on her first visits, because she had understood that it required the right tool in the right hands, and had not been incited on Marion's first visit because Marion had been the one to open it, and what Marion found had produced the expression that had preceded her request to make calls. Today was the day for the iron box. She walked to it and crouched in front of it the way Marion had crouched in front of it 3 weeks ago. She looked at the hasp and the lock and the rust orange of the metal in the refined light of Edmund's equipment. Marion came to stand beside her. She said, "I want to open it again, in better light, with you present this time." She produced the tension wrench from her bag and worked the mechanism with the same practiced patience she had shown on her first visit, and the lock gave again with the small sound that was both minor and in the silence of the stone cellar absolute. Marion lifted the lid. The interior of the iron box was lined with a thin layer of material that had once been felt dried and compressed to almost nothing now, but still present, still performing the function it had been placed there to perform, which was to protect the contents from the metal of the box itself. The contents were documents. Folders of documents organized with a system that communicated the character of the person who had organized them more clearly than any description could. There were acquisition records, each acquisition in its own folder, each folder labeled in a handwriting that Dot had begun to recognize from the few documents she had examined through the photographs on her phone. The handwriting of a person who wrote precisely and without revision, the letters formed with the confidence of someone who knew what they wanted to say before the pen touched the paper. There were provenance records. For pieces that had passed through other hands before reaching Prescott Manor, the documentation traced those passages with a care that exceeded what was legally required and suggested instead the standards of a person who understood that the legitimacy of a collection was not only a legal question, but a historical one, that each object's journey from its origin to the cellar was a story worth telling accurately, regardless of whether anyone required the telling. There were letters, filed in their own section at the back of the box, separated from the acquisition and provenance records by a piece of heavier card that had been cut to fit the box's dimensions. The letters were bundled in chronological order, the earliest at the back and the most recent at the front. Marion lifted the bundle from the box and looked at Dot. She said, "There's one you need to read first. It's on top." The envelope on top of the bundle was not sealed. It had been placed in the envelope, and the envelope had been left open, the way you leave an envelope open when you are not writing to a specific person, but to whoever arrives. The front of the envelope was blank. No name, no address, no salutation. Dot took the envelope. She removed the letter. The paper was the same quality as the envelope, heavy and cream-colored, the kind of stationery purchased for permanence rather than convenience. The handwriting was Roland Prescott's, the handwriting she had come to know from the folders and the labels, precise and unhurried. The handwriting of a man who had spent a great deal of his life corresponding in this way by hand on paper at a pace that the medium required. The letter was dated March 2019. It began, "To whoever understood enough to come down." Dot read the letter standing in the cellar with Edmund's lights illuminating everything around her and Marion beside her and Vera at the far end of the space with her instruments. And she read it slowly, giving each sentence the time it required. Roland Prescott wrote that he had lived in the house above them for 41 years, the last 23 of those alone. He wrote that the solitude had not been a deprivation, but a condition of the work which required the kind of sustained attention that was incompatible with the ordinary social architecture of a life oriented toward other people's needs and expectations. He wrote that he had assembled what was in the cellar across 7 decades, beginning with pieces his grandfather had acquired in the 1920s and 30s, pieces that had come to the family through the particular channels available to American collectors of private means in that era, channels that were legal and documented, and that the papers in the iron box established in full. He wrote that he had continued the work himself beginning in the 1960s with the resources that remained of the family's means after the railroad era had fully ended and the economic landscape had become something his grandfather would not have recognized. He wrote that he had had opportunities to sell, several times and more frequently in his final decades. He wrote that each time he had declined not from hoarding instinct or financial calculation, but from the understanding that what he had assembled had a coherence as a collection that exceeded the value of its individual pieces, and that dispersing it for immediate return was a different kind of act than holding it intact for something he was not in a position to fully specify. He wrote that he had not specified it to his heirs because his heirs had demonstrated clearly and without ambiguity that their interest in what he left behind was financial and not otherwise. He wrote this without bitterness. He wrote it as a fact. He wrote that he had thought a great deal about who would find what he had left. He wrote that he had not known who that person would be. He had known only what he hoped for them. He wrote, "I hope they know what this is before they are told." Not because expertise is a condition of deserving it, but because the right understanding is its own form of inheritance. The person who comes down these stairs and recognizes what they have found has already demonstrated something about how they see the world. That something is what I have always been trying to pass on. The collection is the medium. The understanding is the message. He wrote, "I set the price deliberately. I have watched for 40 years as people drove past this property and looked at it and made their determination from the road. Whatever remains after I am gone should go to the person who looks past the road view. The price ensures that. Money does not open this door. Seeing does." The letter was signed with his full name. Below the signature in smaller letters, as though added after the signature as an afterthought, or perhaps as the thing he had been working toward through the entire letter, "I believe she exists. I have reason to believe she is closer than she knows." Dot stood with the letter in her hands in the stone cellar of Prescott Manor. She read the last line again. She looked at Marion. Marion looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Dot looked at the letter and at the pronoun in the final line. She. She exists. She is closer than she knows. She looked at the bundle of letters still in Marion's hands. She said, "What's behind this one?" Marion held the bundle out to her. Dot took it. She looked at the top envelope which had been behind Roland's letter to whoever came down. This envelope was sealed. The front was addressed in the same handwriting, but this time to a specific person. The name on the envelope was Gerald Finch. Dot did not open the envelope immediately. She held it in both hands and stood in the cellar and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of the paper and nothing else. And also everything else. The accumulated weight of a name written on an envelope in the handwriting of a man she had never met in a cellar she had found by paying $250 for a building that two other people had looked at and walked away from. Marion had stepped back. Edmund had moved to a different section of the cellar. Vera had not looked up from her work. The space had contracted to the size of what was in Dot's hands. She opened the envelope, carefully working her finger along the seal without tearing the paper. The letter inside was 2 pages. The date at the top of the first page was October 2019, 14 months before Gerald died, 11 months before his final hospitalization. Roland Prescott wrote, "Dear Gerald, I have been composing this letter in my mind for several years and am only now committing it to paper because the paper is, I believe, the more reliable medium for what I want to say." He wrote that he and Gerald had been corresponding through the bulletin that the New England Antique Dealers Association had been publishing for 40 years, the quarterly newsletter that went out to members and that carried in its back pages a column of brief notices. Dealers seeking specific pieces or offering specific expertise. The classified advertisement section of a world that preferred not to call what it did advertising. Gerald had placed a notice in 1998 seeking acquisition records for a specific class of New England estate ceramics. Roland had written to the address given not because he had anything to sell, but because the notice had been written with a precision that indicated the person who placed it understood what they were looking for at a level that went beyond casual interest. They had begun corresponding. They had corresponded for 21 years. Roland wrote, "You have described your wife to me many times across these years, always in the way of a man who cannot entirely believe his good fortune in having found the person he found. You have described her work with the particular pride of someone who has watched a great talent operate at close range and has been smart enough to understand what he was seeing." He wrote, "I have listened to those descriptions across 21 years. I have formed a picture of her through your words that is as clear as any picture I might form from direct acquaintance. I believe I know the quality of her eye. I believe I know the quality of her understanding. He wrote, I am going to tell you something I have not told anyone. I am going to tell you because you have been honest with me for 21 years, and honesty deserves its equivalent. And because I am 83 years old, and the calculations of the time remaining do not permit indefinite postponement of things that should be said. He wrote, what I have in the cellar below this house is not what people assume it is. What people assume is the modest accumulation of a solitary old man with more space than sense. What is actually there is something I have spent 70 years assembling with intention and knowledge and resources that my family had and no longer has, and that I have chosen to apply to this purpose rather than to the purposes my family would have preferred. He wrote, when I am gone, the property will go to the county. I have arranged this deliberately. I have set terms that ensure the price will be accessible to someone who is not already wealthy. I have done this because what is in that cellar should go to the person who sees it for what it is, and the person who will see it for what it is will not be the person with the most resources to spend on it. Those people make their determinations from the road. He wrote, I do not know who will find it. I know only what I hope for them, which is that they will have spent enough time learning to see that the seeing will happen before the telling, and that the understanding will be a recognition rather than an instruction. He wrote, your wife sounds like the kind of person who would know what this is the moment she saw it. I have always believed that from everything you have told me across 21 years. I hope she finds her way here, not because she needs to, but because she deserves to. He wrote, give her my regards, though she does not know me. Perhaps someday she will. The letter was signed, yours, Roland. Dot stood in the cellar with 2 pages of paper in her hands, and the lighting equipment throwing its precise illumination across the stone and the shelves and the objects that had been waiting here for a very long time, and she was very still. She thought about Gerald at the kitchen table on Aldermore Road with the quarterly bulletin and his reading glasses and the particular quality of his concentration when he was engaged with something that genuinely interested him, which was a quality she had lived with for 38 years, and that she could summon in complete detail without effort, the slight forward lean, the stillness of the rest of him, the way he would occasionally make a small sound that was not a word, but was a response. She thought about 21 years of letters to an address she had not known existed. She thought about Gerald describing her work to a man he had never met in the way of a man who could not entirely believe his good fortune. She pressed her lips together for a moment. She folded the letter along its original creases and replaced it in the envelope, and held the envelope against her chest with both hands, and stood in the cellar of Prescott Manor in the light of Edmund's equipment, and breathed. She breathed twice evenly through her nose. Marion was beside her. She had moved there quietly without announcement, in the way of someone who understood that proximity was sometimes the only form of support that was appropriate. Dot said without looking at her, he knew Gerald. Marion said yes. Dot said they corresponded for 21 years. Gerald never told me. Marion said no. Dot said he thought I'd find it. Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, Roland thought you'd find it. I think Gerald thought so too. Dot looked up at the stone ceiling of the cellar, the fitted granite of the vault above her, the work of hands that were gone now and that had understood what they were building. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, all right. She put the envelope in her bag. She said, let's finish the assessment. Jeffrey Alcott received Marion's preliminary written assessment on the 14th of December, as Marion had promised. He called Dot the same afternoon and asked her to come to his office the following morning. She came at 9. He placed the assessment on the desk between them. It was 40 pages bound with a plain cover, each section corresponding to a category of the collection, each category documented with preliminary valuations based on Marion's examination and the assessments of her 3 specialist colleagues. The language throughout was the language of professional precision, qualified where qualification was required, and unqualified where the evidence permitted certainty. Alcott walked her through it in the sequence it appeared. The ceramics. Marion's colleague Edmund had authenticated 17 pieces as significant works from the Yongzheng and Qianlong periods, 3 of which he categorized as among the finest examples known in private hands in North America. The preliminary valuation range for the ceramic collection as a whole was provided as a floor rather than a ceiling, pending the additional examinations that several pieces required. The floor was substantial. The painting. Edmund had examined the small landscape in person under controlled conditions and had submitted a 6-page preliminary report that Alcott read from in part the language of a specialist who had been doing this work for 31 years, encountering something that exceeded the category he had arrived with. The painting had been confirmed as consistent in all examined particulars, with the documented work missing since 1943. The provenance records in the iron box established an acquisition chain that explained the gap between the recorded disappearance and the current location. Edmund had filed a notification with the relevant international registry, as was required by protocol, and the response from the institution in Amsterdam that had the strongest prior claim to the work had come within 48 hours, requesting direct communication with the owner's legal representative. Alcott looked at Dot when he said this. He said that response and the speed of it is itself informative. These institutions do not respond within 48 hours to preliminary notifications. This one did. I've spoken with their legal team and they are prepared to negotiate. They understand the ownership situation. The provenance records make the acquisition chain clear. What they want is not the return of the painting, but the opportunity to discuss terms for access and exhibition and loan arrangements. He said the preliminary valuation for the painting, alone accounting for the provenance documentation and current market conditions for authenticated works in this category, is $190 million. That is a conservative figure in Marion's assessment. The room was quiet. Outside Alcott's window, the December city moved through its day people on the sidewalk with their coats and their purposes, the ordinary, indifferent momentum of a Tuesday morning. Dot looked at the assessment on the desk. Alcott continued. The manuscripts. Vera's report was 22 pages, which Alcott said was approximately 19 pages longer than her reports typically ran. The sealed wooden cases had contained correspondence and documents from a period of the mid to late 19th century, the particulars of which Vera had assessed as constituting a coherent archive of significant historical interest. 2 universities had already been in informal contact with Alcott's office, following Marion's notification of the find, which was itself, Alcott said, an indication of the assessment the scholarly community was making independently of the financial valuation. The remaining categories. The acquisition records in the iron box, which were themselves a historical document of significance. The additional objects in the remaining crates, which range from decorative arts to scientific instruments of the period, each assessed individually, each with its preliminary range. Alcott set the report down. He looked at Dot across the desk with the direct attention of a man who had been in this work long enough to have learned that there were moments when the professional framing was insufficient for what the moment required, and that recognizing those moments was itself a professional competence. He said the preliminary total using the conservative end of every valuation range provided across all categories is $427 million. He said it the way Marion had communicated things in the cellar as a fact rather than a revelation, steadily with the weight of it fully present in the air of the room. Dot looked at him. She did not speak for a moment. She thought about a Tuesday morning in November when she had sat in a different office and listened to her son explain in careful language why she could no longer be trusted to manage her own affairs. She thought about the number he had stated then, $71,000 in debt, the way that number had sat in the room with the authority of a conclusion rather than a condition. She thought about $250 in a bus to County Road 6 in a flashlight that cost $1.75. She thought about Gerald at the kitchen table with his reading glasses, in the quarterly bulletin, and the particular quality of his attention when he was engaged with something that genuinely interested him. She said, "Is the ownership clean?" Alcott said, I've reviewed every document in the iron box and cross-referenced the acquisition records with historical databases and legal records from the relevant periods. The collection was assembled through legitimate acquisition. The documentation is meticulous. The ownership chain from Roland Prescott to the county to you is without ambiguity. Yes, it's clean, Dot said in Alderton and Pierce. He said, withdrawn completely. Burton Graves has made no further contact. Without a statutory basis and without a valid standing argument, there is nothing for them to work with. She said, what happens next? He walked her through it. The sequence of steps, the categories that would move first, and the categories that required more time. The auction process for the ceramics and the painting, the separate conversations required for the manuscripts and the archival materials, the negotiations with the Amsterdam institution, the legal framework for the transfer of funds as each category was realized. He said the ceramics could be consigned to a specialist house within 90 days pending the final authentication steps Marion had outlined. He said the painting would require a longer process given the particular category and the institutional interest, but that the timeline was measured in months, not years. He said, I want to make sure something is addressed that is separate from the legal framework. He paused. Your immediate circumstances, the debt the household costs. I want to propose a bridge arrangement that allows you to stabilize while the collection process moves forward. It would be structured through my firm as an advance against the anticipated proceeds, and it would be fully covered several times over by the first category to realize. He said it without apology and without the careful framing that people sometimes applied to conversations about money when they thought the money might embarrass the person they were speaking to. He said it because it was relevant and because her circumstances were part of the picture he had to manage correctly. Dot said yes. She said it without hesitation in the same tone she used for decisions she had already made before being asked. He said, good. She left his office at 11:15. She stood on the sidewalk outside in the December cold, the city moving around her in both directions, and she let herself feel it. Not the number. The number was notation, a symbol for something that had no sufficient symbol. What she felt was the thing the number pointed to. The 13 months of managing alone, the electricity bill and the oil tank, and the debt statement that she had stopped opening because the number did not change by being looked at. The conference room and the color-coded tabs. Gerald's reading chair still at the angle he had left it. And beneath a 4-story granite ruin on County Road 6, in a stone cellar built to outlast the circumstances of any single life, a collection assembled across 70 years of careful human intention that had been waiting for the right eyes. She stood on the sidewalk in the December cold and let all of it move through her at once the way water moves through something it has found its way into without asking permission, without apologizing for the space it takes. Then she walked to the parking garage and drove to Aldermore Road. Daniel called that evening. He called at 7, which was when he called when he was calling with something he had decided and not with something he was still deciding. Dot recognized the timing. She answered. He said, Mom, I need to talk to you about the petition. She said, all right. He said, I want to withdraw it. He paused. I've been doing some research about the property and about the collection and about what Jeffrey Alcott filed against Alderton and Pierce. I talked to a friend who practices estate law in Concord, and he walked me through what happened, and He stopped. Dot waited. He said, I owe you an apology. Not just for the petition, for the whole of the last year, for the conference room and the tabs, and he stopped again. He said, I was watching you lose ground, and I thought the most useful thing I could do was step in and take the decision-making away from you. I thought that was protecting you. He said I was wrong about what you needed, and I was wrong about whether you needed protecting. Dot said, Daniel. He said, I know you don't need me to. He stopped. She said, I know why you did it. I'm not going to make you explain it further than you already have. She paused. But I need you to understand something. The thing you were trying to protect me from was the last piece of myself I had left. After 41 years of building something with your father and then losing him, The guardianship petition wasn't protection. It was the other kind. There was a silence on the line. He said, I know. I understand that now. I'm sorry it took me this long. She said, come to the property this weekend. I want to show you what I've done with the porch. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Mom, what do you need me to do? She thought about Roland Prescott's letter and the line about the person who would come down the stairs and recognize what they found. She thought about the line that described her, the one that said she exists. She is closer than she knows. She said, come on Saturday. Bring Patricia if she wants to come. And bring Willa. He said Willa would love that. She said, I know. That's why I said it. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table in the kitchen on Aldermore Road and looked at Gerald's reading chair where it still stood at the angle he had left it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and moved it 18 inches to the left, to the position that had always been slightly better for the light from the window, the position she had always meant to suggest to him. She stood back and looked at it. She thought, there. Better. The ceramics auction was held in New York in the third week of March. Marion had recommended the auction house a firm that specialized in Asian decorative arts and that had handled collections of this category with the understanding that the material deserved. The consignment process had taken 3 months, during which each piece was individually cataloged, photographed, and described in the auction house's language, which was the language of a field that had spent a long time developing the vocabulary to describe things for which ordinary language was insufficient. Dot attended. Alcott had suggested it. He had said she should be there not because her presence was necessary, but because it was hers. The collection was hers, and being present for the moment it entered the world seemed to him like something a person should be given the choice to witness. She flew to New York the day before. She stayed at a hotel that was not extravagant and was not the kind of hotel she had stayed in before this year. And she sat at the window the night before the auction and looked at the city below and thought about a cellar in New Hampshire and the distance between there and here and the steps that connected them. She sat in the auction room and watched the bidding move through the pieces she had held in flashlight beams in November, the glazed surfaces she had turned over in her palms, the base marks she had read with 35 years of accumulated knowledge. She watched the numbers move, and she did not try to manage what she felt because there was no useful reason to manage it, and because some things were not improved by management. She felt something she did not have a name for on behalf of Roland Prescott, a man she had never met, whose work she had inherited without knowing his name until it was almost too late to matter. A man who had spent 7 decades assembling something extraordinary and who had understood its worth and who had set a price of $250 like a sentence written in a language that most people had forgotten how to read. She felt the weight of all the years the collection had sat below the floor waiting for those eyes. She felt Gerald. She felt him in the particular way of the past 14 months, which was as a presence that had not dissolved but had changed form that existed now. Not as a body in a chair or a voice on the phone, but as a quality of attention that she recognized when she was paying attention herself. She felt him in this room in the particular way of someone who had spent 21 years writing to a man he had never met about the woman who could see what others missed and who had believed that eventually the seeing would happen. She thought I found it, Gerald. She thought you knew I would. The ceramics auction realized 41% above the preliminary authenticated valuation. The figure was communicated to her by Alcott by text during the lunch break, and she read it on her phone in the lobby of the auction house, and then put the phone in her bag and stood in the lobby for a moment with the noise of the city outside and the particular busy quiet of the building around her. The painting was handled separately through a negotiated process that Alcott managed over the subsequent months with the Amsterdam Institution and with 2 additional parties who expressed formal interest after the authentication was publicly registered. The process was careful and long and resulted in an arrangement that Alcott described as the best possible outcome, which meant that the painting's return to institutional access was accomplished alongside a financial realization that accounted for Dot's ownership rights without requiring a public auction. By October, the full financial picture had clarified into something she could look at directly. The Prescott Finch Heritage Fund was established in November, 12 months after Dot had stood at the gate of Prescott Manor and looked at 4 stories of dark granite and walked forward anyway. Alcott had helped her structure it with the care he brought to everything, and Marion had sat on the founding advisory board alongside Edmund and Vera and 2 other specialists who had been part of the authentication process. The fund's purpose was specific support for independent appraisers and small estate specialists, the people who did the work that large institutions did not cover, who went to the storage units and the attics and the cellars, and did the difficult work of seeing what was actually there rather than what appeared to be there. It was named for Roland Prescott, who had assembled what made it possible, and for Gerald Finch, who had spent 21 years corresponding with a man he had never met about the importance of seeing things clearly. Dot had not named it for herself. This was not modesty. It was the same principle that had governed everything from the signing of the papers at the county office forward, which was that the work was the thing, and the person doing the work was the medium through which the work happened, and the medium was not the point. She moved into Prescott Manor in the spring. She moved in with what she had, which was the furniture from Aldermore Road and Gerald's reading chair, which she placed in the library on the ground floor in the position that got the best light from the restored windows, the position that Gerald would have chosen himself if he had stood in the room and considered it. The renovation had taken 4 months and had been done by a contractor named Elias Pruitt, Walter's nephew, a man who moved through the building with the same quality of attention his uncle brought to the woodpile and the kitchen garden. Understanding the building's structure before he began respecting what it had achieved in 137 years of standing. He had said on his first visit, looking at the foundation stones, "These aren't footings. These are a commitment." He had said it with the tone of someone who found this admirable. The east wing remained unrestored. That was Dot's decision, and she made it after some thought. The collapsed wing was the building's wound, and the building had carried it for 40 years and was still standing, and there was something in that she was not ready to erase. The wound was part of the argument the building made about endurance, and the argument had earned its place in the final form of the thing. The cellar was empty now. The objects had been moved by Edmund and his colleagues to the appropriate secure facilities in the first weeks of the process, transported with the care of people who understood exactly what they were handling. The shelving remained the iron brackets, holding nothing, the darkened wood of the shelves, still solid and permanent in the way of things built to outlast the purposes they were built for. The iron box sat on the stone floor where it had always sat empty, now its lock lying beside it, its lid open, its purpose completed. Dot went down the stairs regularly, not to assess, not to document, simply to stand in the space and be in it, to feel the cold of the stone and the smell of the deep earth and the silence that had held everything for so long and now held only itself. She found she needed the reminder. Willa came on a Saturday in May, her first visit to the manor, arriving in the back seat of Daniel's car with the particular energy of a 9-year-old who had been told she was going somewhere interesting and had spent the drive working herself into a state of readiness for interesting things. She went through the building with the systematic thoroughness of a child conducting an expedition, asking questions about each room and its function, and what had happened to the furniture, and whether the tower was safe to go up in, and what the marks on the library shelves meant, and whether there had ever been a dog. Dot answered each question directly without condescending to them, because Willa's questions were not the questions of a child performing curiosity, but of a child who was actually curious, and the difference was worth respecting. They ended in the kitchen. The kitchen had been rebuilt around the original slate counters and the restored range, which Elias had spent 2 weeks returning to working condition with the reverence that the object deserved. The window above the sink looked out over the back garden, which was in its spring state, the beds turned and the early growth beginning to show, and the stone path running its length under the light. Willa looked out the window at the garden and at Walter, who was at the far end of the path doing something with the border plantings, with the focused application he brought to all garden work. Then she looked at the photograph on the windowsill. It was a black and white photograph in a simple frame. Dot and Gerald standing in front of their booth at a regional antiques fair in Vermont the summer of 1991. Dot was 45 in the photograph. Gerald was 47. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking at each other in the way of people who have been looking at each other for a long time and still find the view worth returning to. Willa looked at the photograph for a moment. She said, "That's Grandpa." Dot said, "It is." Willa said, "He looks happy." Dot said, "He was." Willa looked at the photograph a while longer. Then she said, "Grandma, did he know about the stuff in the basement?" Dot was quiet for a moment. She thought about 21 years of letters between two men who had never met, one of them writing to the other about his wife's particular quality of seeing, and the other writing back to say he had left something here that was waiting for exactly that quality. She said, "I think he had a feeling." Willa thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things that she was trying to understand in full. She said, "Is that why you bought it, because of his feeling?" Dot looked at her granddaughter's face. The unguarded quality of it, the directness of a child who had not yet learned to manage her attention into something less obvious than what it was. She said, "I bought it because of my own." Willa seemed to accept this. She looked out the window at the garden and at Walter at the far end of the path with his tools. She said, "Can we go out there?" Dot said, "Yes, put your coat on." They went out through the kitchen door into the spring morning. Dot and Willa, and behind them, the kitchen of Prescott Manor settled into its quiet. The range warm, the slate counters cool, the windows showing the garden and the path, and the border plantings in their early color, and Walter moving steadily among them. The cellar door stood closed in the rear wall, its iron loop cold and still, the paint around its frame showing the seam that was visible only at the right angle of light. The cellar below was empty and clean and silent. Its shelves bare, the iron box open and hollow at the center of the far wall, the stone floor smooth and permanent beneath it all. The building above settled around it the way old structures settle in the small sounds of things that have been standing long enough to know their own weight, shifting and creaking and returning to stillness. Dot moved along the stone path with Willa beside her toward Walter and the border plantings, in the back garden opening into the spring morning around them. Willa found a stick along the path's edge and considered it and decided to keep it. She asked something about the shrubs that Dot answered. She asked something about the tower that Dot answered differently, with the kind of honesty that children receive better than they were usually given credit for. At the end of the path, Dot stopped. She pressed her hand against the stone wall at the garden's end. The granite was cold and solid under her palm, the same stone that had been there since 1887, fitted by hands that were gone now and that had understood what they were building. She felt the depth of it and the weight of it and the absolute certainty of it, the way it did not yield. She thought about a November morning in a conference room and her son's color-coded tabs. She thought about an iron gate seized open in a formal drive going nowhere, and 4 stories of dark granite rising against the sky. She thought about a door painted to match the wall around it and an iron loop that required lifting before pulling. She thought about Gerald at the table with his reading glasses and his 21 years of letters to a man he had never met, writing about his wife. The way a man writes about something he cannot quite believe his luck in having found. She thought about $4.26 and a $1.75 flashlight in the cold of a stone cellar, and the particular moment when her hands had stopped moving because they had recognized what she was holding before her mind had caught up. She thought about all of it in sequence, and all of it at once, and she held it with the steadiness of someone who had learned that some things were too large for any single posture and had to be held in motion as a series of moments rather than a single fact, each one true in itself and all of them together, making the shape of something that had no other name than what it was. Willa tugged her sleeve. She said, "Grandma, look." She was pointing at the border shrubs where the first of the spring flowers had opened that morning in a cluster of white along the top of the planting, exactly as they had come every year before this year, and exactly as they would come in every year that followed, without being asked, without requiring gratitude, simply performing the work they were built to perform at the time they were built to perform it. Dot looked at them. She said, "I see them." She pressed her hand once more against the stone wall and then released it and turned toward the garden. Walter was watching them from the far end of the path with the expression of someone who had been watching something for a long time and had finally arrived at the moment he had been watching for. He raised his hand slightly, not a wave, in acknowledgement. Dot raised hers in return. Then she walked with her granddaughter through the garden of Prescott Manor in the May morning, through the light and the smell of the white flowers, and the sound of Willa's stick against the stone path, through the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a morning that was simply itself unremarkable from the outside, and carrying on the inside everything that had been built toward it. She was home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.